Hi, this is Synthchaser from Synthchaser.com. I'm in the process of repairing this early Tonus logo ARP 2600, and I came across a couple of problems that I thought would make for an interesting repair video. First off, we've got a problem with the sample and hold. Instead of sampling and holding the white noise source, it's just passing the white noise through. So here we'll turn oscillator 1 up in the mix, and we'll use sample and hold as a modulation source. And we can hear that it's just noise coming through. Secondly, one of the two inputs of the Ring Modulator isn't working. So we'll turn Ring Modulator on, and we're just getting VCO1 passed straight through the Ring Modulator without being modulated. VCO2 isn't making it through the Ring Modulator at all. A couple videos back I showed a look inside the various models of ARP 2600s, and this was one of the synths from that video. I pointed out how on ARP 2600s most of the core synthesis features, like the oscillators, the filter, and the VCA, were made into submodules, which through much of the production run were encapsulated like these. The Ring Modulator and sample and hold were encapsulated as well. ARP submodules had model numbers starting with 4. The Ring Modulator used in the ARP 2600 was this 4014 module, and the sample and hold was the 4015 module, although the label seems to be missing on this one. Since both the sample and hold and Ring Modulators are broken, good suspects would be the submodules. But before we start trying to fix things, let's be absolutely sure of this by confirming with the oscilloscope. Alright, let's start with the Ring Modulator. It's pretty straightforward. Besides the power pins, there's an X input, a Y input, an input to trim the gain of the output, and the output itself. So let's look at the two inputs. So here's the first one. Let's see here. This is a VCO1 sawtooth, and we can adjust the frequency of VCO1 with the slider, and we see it changing here. So that looks okay. Let's hop over to the next input. This is VCO2 sine wave. Looks a little noisy on the scope, but we can see here that the frequency is changing when I change the VCO2 slider, so that input is making it to the input pin there. Let's hop on over now to the output pin and change the scale of the scope again. And what we see here is kind of a square wave, and it looks like I'm changing the VCO1 slider here. This is basically just VCO1's sawtooth wave greatly amplified and then clipped at the top. If I change the VCO2 slider, the VCO2 frequency slider, nothing's changing there. So it's now safe to say that this submodule is jacked up. And jacked up is the technical term for not working correctly. Alright, now let's check the sample and hold. It's even more straightforward. Besides the power pins, there's a signal input pin, which is for the signal we want to sample, which in this case is white noise. And there's a sample input pin, which is the trigger that says it's time to sample. And then there's the output pin, which will have our randomly stepping sample and hold voltage. So let's look at the inputs, starting here with the white noise signal. So clip on here. I can catch that. There we go. And here on the scope we see our random white noise source. So let's move to the next pin, the trigger, the sample input pin, which should have our trigger to sample. Here we may need to make this a little bit bigger, and there it is. So our signal and our sample signals are making it to the submodule. So let's swing around to the other side now and take a look at the output. What's going on here? Let's see. Well, this is interesting. This is what a working sample and hold should look like. But we heard it a second ago and it was white noise. So I have the synthesizer propped up on these 2x4s so I can access the sliders or plug in patch cords or whatever I need to do to change the settings on the panel while I'm troubleshooting it. So let me get down there underneath and we'll turn on oscillator 1. turn on the sample and hold. And here it's working. Let me turn that off. So it's interesting that the sample and hold problem went away when I folded the panel down. That kind of tells me that it's more a mechanical issue, like maybe a cracked solder joint or broken wire or loose wire or something like that, rather than an electronics problem. The sample and hold module itself we verified is working. So I'll track that down and repair it so it works reliably regardless of what position the front panel's in. But the interesting problem that I think we're going to continue to press on with this video is the Ring Modulator submodule, which is bad. I mentioned in the last ARP 2600 video that at the beginning these submodules were potted in epoxy, making them unserviceable. I failed to mention that later modules were potted in silicone caulk instead of epoxy. Though for those of you who watch my channel, you might remember seeing a couple different videos where I cracked open these submodules, excavated them, and repaired them. I'll link one of those videos at the end of this one. Here I'm not sure what these modules are potted in. Even on early 2600s, it's always a possibility that the modules were replaced at some point with newer ones. So let's evaluate our options here and come up with a game plan. This submodule's bad. It may or may not be potted in epoxy. If it's potted in epoxy, we're not going to be able to repair it, and we need to replace the module. Even if it's not potted in epoxy, it's time-consuming to excavate it, and it's easier just to replace it. As far as replacement options, I make and sell a variety of replacement modules for ARP synthesizers, but I don't have this one in my catalog yet. So I could make one, and it would look sort of like this, which is the 4035 Moog ladder filter that I make for the ARP Odyssey. There are also some places selling kits or blank PCBs to build replacement modules. This is a synth that I own and will be selling. I'm going to base my decision on what's best for the synthesizer, not what's the cheapest or quickest fix. And I want to preserve the originality of this vintage synthesizer as much as possible. So if this submodule can be repaired, I want it to stay in the synth. And if not, I want to replace it with the highest quality replacement available. That means I need to design and lay out one myself on a real professionally manufactured PCB, not perf board and not a home-etched circuit board. But whatever route we wind up going, this original module is going to need to come out of the synthesizer. We can get this module out without even freeing up the board it's attached to. We'll use some solder wick to desolder the pins. The area that we took the module out of looks a bit nasty because of all the burned up flux residue. This is both flux from the solder wick and also from the original flux from when ARP soldered the module there in the first place. They didn't clean their flux residues, but we will. I used to use denatured alcohol, but they made that illegal here in California, along with countless other things. So now I'm using acetone, inhaling some really unpleasant vapors. But it does the job nicely, and now the PCB is all clean. So now we've got to crack open this submodule and see what we're up against. This black part on the top and sides is a plastic case. On the bottom, we see the pins sticking out of this other black stuff, which is a really hard epoxy. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're done for. Even the silicone potted modules had this layer of epoxy here, but the board and components were underneath in caulk. Kind of like an ice cream sundae. The black plastic box is the bowl, the caulk's the ice cream, and the layer of epoxy was the hot fudge on the top. So then I guess you could say the circuit board was floating in the ice cream. So let's crack this open and hope we have a hot fudge sundae and not an epoxy brick. Denied. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the caulk here on the side now that we got the plastic case off. This is a solid epoxy module. So we're going to have to lay out a replacement ring modulator. And like I said before, at the end of this video, I'll link one of my previous videos where I successfully excavate and repair one of the ARP submodules that's potted in caulk instead of this super hard, impenetrable epoxy. So I'm taking some measurements now that I'm going to use to lay out the circuit board so the pins on my module will perfectly line up with the pins on the circuit board. And I mentioned that, a possibility was just to go straight to the replacement module, even if the original module was repairable, it was in caulk. And the approach that people choose for this type of repair is based on their individual situation. Maybe they can't afford to pay a tech for the labor-intensive process of excavating the submodule on the chance that the tech can repair it. Maybe they can't find a qualified tech in their area. Maybe they want to do the repair themselves, and swapping a module like we're going to do is something that they can do, but troubleshooting and repairing the submodule isn't. Maybe the submodule is missing, or maybe it isn't even original to begin with. There are a lot of reasons why people would want or need a replacement module instead of repairing an original, so we won't judge. In fact, we're going to do it here. So this is as far as I can take the Ring Modulator right now. What I need to do next is I need to get on my CAD software and capture the schematic for the Ring Modulator. I have the original hand-drawn ARP schematic for it. There's also a nice, neat copy of it on the internet. Then what I need to do is I need to lay out the circuit board. So make sure those pins that I measured are in the right spot so it fits the footprint of the original module, and lay out the other components relative to that. I need to send the circuit board layout to a PCB fabrication house to have circuit boards manufactured for me. They need to be manufactured and shipped to me, and when they arrive I need to assemble the boards. So I need to solder all the different components to it, and then I need to test the boards. And that's a fairly time-consuming process, so it'll be probably several weeks before that gets done and I'm ready to resume filming this video. So I'm going to skip to that, so in a blink of an eye I'll be standing here with the circuit board in my hand and ready to be installed. But the process of making the circuit board that you're going to see in a second is not trivial and does not happen in the blink of an eye like you might perceive based on the editing of this video. So it's been a few weeks and my new Ring Modulator circuit boards have arrived, and I've built them and tested them. And while I was at it, I went ahead and built the sample and hold submodule as well. As necessity's been dictating, I've been making replacements for ARP submodules, and eventually I hope to have replacements for all the ARP submodules. So you may look at this and go, my God, that looks nothing like the original submodule. It's a travesty that that joker Synthchaser is going to ruin this 2600 by putting this abomination inside. So let's address a few myths. First, I've seen some online conjecture that the layout of a circuit board somehow contributes to the sound of that circuit. So a clone isn't going to sound like the original unless the circuit board is identical to the original. Because, like electrons can't turn around 90-degree corners, they need curved traces and stuff. I've even seen some supposedly reputable texts spreading this BS. Lies like this are just an excuse to be lazy and steal someone else's copyrighted circuit board layout. At audio frequencies, 20 Hz to 20 kHz, the circuit board layout is nearly completely irrelevant. Next, we have people who think that a through-hole part sounds different than a surface mount part. For IC chips and other semiconductors, the same silicon die is inside your through-hole part that's inside your surface mount part. Just the packaging is different. For passive components, SMD parts may be composed of different materials than their through-hole counterparts and have some different characteristics. So in that case, you're comparing apples to oranges. Capacitors are a great example. There are some SMD film capacitors, but the majority are ceramic, tantalum, and electrolytic. I'd be certain that capacitors with the same dielectric, but different packaging, like these two here, sound the same. But do capacitors with a different dielectric sound different? I think it depends. People swear they make a huge difference, but they don't back it up with any data, and usually don't even pay any regard to how the part's being used in the circuit. From my experience in education, I understand it's overwhelmingly the circuit design that forms the character of the sound, much more so than the material used in building it, so long as the parts aren't grossly inappropriately spec'd for what they're being used for. That may be a fun idea for a video. We can get the spectrum analyzer out and A/B compare a vintage module with an SMD clone like this one. ARP went to some lengths to match the transistors they used, and they thermally coupled them with the little copper bands like on this ARP filter. Here on the replacement board, we've got two matched transistors on the same die. You can't get more thermally coupled than that. So if there's any difference, in my opinion, a change like this is only bringing it closer to what the designer intended in the first place. Finally, there's the issue of serviceability. People say that SMD stuff isn't serviceable. And there's a bit of truth to this, but it's not always the case. It's true that SMD stuff may be harder to solder for most people who don't do it professionally. It requires both a different set of tools and techniques than through-hole soldering. But like on this module, we're not talking about what you see in typical consumer electronics. There's no BGA chips or 0402 resistors or anything like that. So all these kinds of parts are very serviceable by someone who's serious enough to commit to getting the right equipment, which doesn't cost much, and to put in the time to practice technique, which doesn't take much time to pick up. A through-hole board can be hacked to bits by someone who doesn't know how to through-hole solder just as easily as an SMD board can be. Trust me, I've seen it. In my opinion, it's other factors that give SMD the stigma of not being serviceable. For one, many modern designs use pre-programmed microcontrollers or custom IC chips that aren't available to buy anywhere. Also, as time has progressed, we can do more things with electronics and devices have gotten more complex, inherently making them less serviceable than older, simpler products. That's not a fault of SMD, that's just progress. And to make matters worse, manufacturers have stopped publishing schematics for their stuff like they did on the older designs, which discourages board-level repair. So the new low-level fix is now swapping circuit boards or throwing the gear away and buying a new one, which is often more economical than repairing the old one. But I'm getting off track here. Bottom line is, for anyone in the market for a replacement ARP submodule, if your old one was so serviceable, why do you need a new one anyways? So before I go ahead and pop this in, I want to show you where the weak link for the sample and hold was. So the weak link were these Molex connectors here on board 5-1. I also noticed that the left speaker would be intermittent for the same reason. The pins coming here off of board 5 are gold-plated, so I've ordered some new gold-plated headers, these white receptacles, and we're going to replace all the connectors on this board. Either the originals weren't gold-plated or the contacts have just lost their tension. But a rule of thumb is if reseating a connector fixes your problem, you need to replace the connector, not just reseat it. Otherwise the problem's just going to come back. So here's our new Ring Modulator installed. So this still needs some calibration, but now it's working as intended. So R2-D2 sounds, here we come. I still need to go through this 2600 and restore it, but I just wanted to repair all the functionality first. I'm a bit bummed that the repair was just replacing the submodule instead of excavating it and repairing it, but you can go ahead and click through to my older video to see how I do that. And hopefully my somewhat off-topic rambling was interesting and you learned something new. If you're not subscribed to my channel already, please be sure to subscribe. We've got a Jupiter 4 repair video coming up that I think you're not going to want to miss. This has been Synthchaser from synthchaser.com. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.